There is a specific, pathetic kind of cruelty in tearing down a child. When 3 local punks kicked over a 7-year-old girl's lemonade stand, stealing her $22 in loose change, they thought they were the untouchable kings of a dead-end street. They walked away laughing. They didn't know the quiet guy living 3 doors down was a patched member of the Hells Angels. And they definitely didn't know he was about to make a phone call that would shake the pavement. The heat in Rockford did not arrive gently. It landed on the streets like a wet, heavy wool blanket by 9 in the morning, baking the oil stains into the cracked asphalt and turning the air hazy. It was the kind of neighborhood where the houses sat too close together, their aluminum siding fading from decades of harsh Midwestern winters and blistering summers. The world here felt tired. People worked double shifts at the packing plant or the regional hospital, coming home with heavy feet and eyes that stared straight through the television. Lucy was 7. She hadn't yet learned to be cynical about her zip code. To her, the crumbling sidewalk out front wasn't a sign of urban decay. It was just a canvas for blue chalk. Her mother, Sarah, was a different story. Sarah was 28, but carried the posture of someone 10 years older. She worked at a diner out by the interstate, pouring burnt coffee for truckers who tipped in crumpled single bills and lingering glances. Lucy knew her mother was exhausted. She heard the soft, stifled sighs at the kitchen table late at night, when Sarah sorted through the mail, dividing the envelopes into piles of now and later. Next week was Sarah's birthday. Lucy had seen a pair of silver-plated earrings in the window of the pawn shop downtown. They were $12. To a 7-year-old with no allowance, $12 was a towering sum, an amount that required industry. So, on a blistering Tuesday morning, Lucy went into business. The setup was rudimentary. A card table with one rusted locking hinge that required a piece of folded cardboard underneath to keep it level. A white plastic tablecloth adorned with faded red apples. A heavy glass pitcher, originally belonging to her grandmother, filled with a neon yellow liquid that was roughly 40% powdered mix, 60% tap water, and packed with ice cubes clinking against the glass. The sign was taped to the front of the table, "Ice-cold lemonade, 50 cents. Have a great day." The S in cents was backwards. For the first 2 hours, the neighborhood was merciful. Mr. Henderson, the retired mechanic from across the street, shuffled over in his slippers. He bought 2 cups, handed her a crisp $5 bill, and told her to keep the change. The mailman paused his route, wiping sweat from his forehead, and traded 2 quarters for a paper cup of the sugary yellow water. By 1 o'clock, the ice had melted into small, translucent slivers, but the old metal cigar box Lucy was using as a cash register rattled with a heavy, satisfying weight. She had $22. It was more than enough for the earrings. She even had enough left over to buy a frozen pop from the ice cream truck if it came through. Lucy sat on a plastic lawn chair, her legs dangling, swinging back and forth. The sun beat down, making her dark hair hot to the touch, but she didn't care. She felt the fierce, surging pride of a provider. She pulled the lid off the cigar box just to look at the bills and the silver coins, running her small, sticky fingers over Washington's profile on the quarters. It was honest money. It was a tangible piece of hope sitting on a battered folding table on a street that had largely forgotten what hope looked like. She didn't notice the rusted grey Honda Civic turning onto the block. She didn't hear the deep, irregular rattle of its failing muffler. She was too busy calculating whether the pawn shop would put the earrings in a small box, or if she'd have to wrap them in newspaper. The world is full of predators, but they aren't always criminal masterminds or shadowy cartel bosses. Most of the time, evil is just bored, mediocre, and lazy. The Civic pulled up to the curb, tires scraping the concrete. The music thumping from the car's blown-out speakers was deafening, rattling the loose plastic of the vehicle's interior. Inside were 3 young men in their early 20s. They belonged to that specific demographic of neighborhood bottom feeders who wore oversized, unwashed clothes, sported cheap stick-and-poke tattoos on their knuckles, and hung around the gas station at midnight looking for someone weaker to intimidate. Trent was behind the wheel. He had a patchy beard and a spiderweb tattooed on his neck that looked more like a smudge of grease. Beside him was Kyle, a guy who never outgrew his high school bully phase, and in the back was a kid everyone just called Beau. They had spent the morning smoking cheap weed and getting angry at the world for not handing them a living. Trent killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and immediately threatening. He stepped out of the car, slamming the door. Kyle followed. They didn't walk with purpose. They slouched, kicking at loose gravel, their eyes scanning the street for entertainment. They saw the table. They saw the little girl. More importantly, they saw the open cigar box sitting next to the yellow pitcher. Lucy froze. The swinging of her legs stopped. The survival instinct in children is sharp, unclouded by the social niceties that adults use to rationalize danger. She knew instantly that these men were not here to buy lemonade. "Look at this," Trent said, his voice a nasal, mocking drawl. He leaned over the table, bringing the smell of stale beer and unwashed sweat into Lucy's personal space. "Kids out here making a fortune? You got a permit for this, little girl?" Lucy swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She shook her head. "No," Kyle chuckled, leaning against the front of the Civic, crossing his arms. "No permit. That's illegal. You're breaking the law, kid." I'm just selling lemonade," Lucy whispered. Her small hands instinctively moved toward the cigar box, trying to slide the metal lid closed. Trent's hand shot out, moving with a sudden, vicious speed. He slammed his palm down on the lid, pinning Lucy's fingers against the sharp metal edge of the box. She yelped, pulling her hand back to her chest, cradling the bruised fingers. Ah! Trent grinned, exposing a chipped front tooth. "Don't be rude. I'm parched. Pour me a cup." Trembling, Lucy reached for the heavy glass pitcher with her good hand. The condensation made it slippery. She struggled to lift it, pouring the pale yellow liquid into a flimsy paper cup. Some of it spilled onto the tablecloth. Trent picked up the cup, took a deliberately slow sip, and spat it directly onto the asphalt. "Tastes like piss," he sneered. "You charging 50 cents for garbage, kid? Leave her alone, Trent. Just grab the cash." Kyle muttered from the car, looking nervously down the empty street. He wasn't bothered by the cruelty, he was just impatient. Trent ignored him. He looked down at Lucy, whose eyes were wide, welling with thick, terrified tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the power. He enjoyed making someone else feel as small and pathetic as he secretly knew he was. "I think you owe us a refund," Trent said softly. He didn't wait for her to process the demand. He grabbed the cigar box. Lucy let out a sharp, desperate cry. "No, that's for my mom," and lunged forward. Trent laughed, easily shoving her back by the shoulder. Lucy hit the plastic lawn chair and tumbled to the grass, scraping her elbow on a stray rock. With a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, Trent tossed the contents of the cigar box into his pockets, letting a few pennies scatter onto the pavement. Then, looking down at the little girl on the grass, he placed his boot flat against the edge of the card table and pushed hard. The rusted hinge snapped. The table collapsed violently. The heavy glass pitcher hit the concrete with a loud, sickening crack, shattering into jagged shards. A tidal wave of sticky yellow liquid, crushed ice, and dirt washed over the sidewalk, pooling around the white plastic tablecloth. The paper cups scattered into the gutter. "Keep the change," Trent said. He climbed back into the Civic. The engine roared to life, coughing blue smoke out of the tailpipe. The tires screeched against the curb, leaving a thick black mark on the concrete, and the car sped off down the block, the heavy bass of their music fading into the oppressive afternoon heat. Lucy sat in the grass. She didn't scream. She didn't wail. She just stared at the broken glass and the wet, ruined cardboard sign. The $22 were gone. The earrings were gone. The pride was gone. All that was left was the sticky smell of artificial lemon and the harsh, cynical reality that no matter how hard you tried, the world could just step on you for fun. The tears finally broke, silent and heavy, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. 4 houses down, Arthur was bleeding a brake line. Nobody called him Arthur. He was a man built like a brick retaining wall, broad-shouldered and heavy-chested, carrying 250 pounds of dense muscle and scar tissue. His beard was thick, aggressively graying, framing a face that had seen the inside of too many roadhouses, jail cells, and hospital rooms. His arms were covered in faded ink. The most prominent tattoo was the winged death head on his right forearm, mirroring the massive 3-piece patch on the leather cut currently draped over a folding chair in his garage. They called him Dutch. He was a fully patched member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, a man who had ridden with the local charter for 23 years. Dutch lived quietly. In the outlaw biker world, you learned to separate the chaos of the club from the sanctuary of the driveway. He didn't throw wild parties at his house. He paid his property taxes, kept his lawn cut, and mostly kept a wrench in his hand. He was an intimidating presence, a ghost who smelled of 10W40 motor oil, stale Marlboro Reds, and old leather. The neighbors avoided his gaze out of a deeply ingrained respect bordering on fear, and Dutch was perfectly fine with that arrangement. He had heard the muffled thumping of the Honda Civic stereo a few minutes earlier. He had felt a mild annoyance, disrespectful noise in a quiet neighborhood, but he ignored it, focusing on the caliper bolt. Then he heard the shattering of thick glass. It was a sharp, violent sound that cut through the dull hum of the summer afternoon. Dutch paused. He didn't flinch, but his hand stopped moving. The instincts forged by decades of violent, unpredictable environments flared to life. He listened to the screech of the tires, identifying the distinct whine of a struggling 4-cylinder engine speeding away. Dutch wiped his greasy hands on a red shop rag, tossed it onto his workbench, and walked out of the shaded garage into the blinding sun. He looked down the street. He saw the skid mark on the curb. He saw the collapsed card table. And he saw the little girl sitting in the grass, her knees pulled to her chest, surrounded by a puddle of broken glass and yellow slush. Dutch knew Lucy. Not formally, but he observed his territory. He knew she was a polite kid who drew chalk animals on the sidewalk. He knew her mother drove a beat-up Ford Taurus and worked her fingers to the bone. Dutch respected people who worked. He despised parasites. His heavy steel-toed boots made a steady, rhythmic crunch against the pavement as he walked down the block. He didn't rush. He moved with a heavy, terrifying inevitability. When he reached the end of Sarah's driveway, he stopped. Lucy looked up. The sight of Dutch was usually enough to make adults cross the street. He was wearing oil-stained jeans, a black t-shirt pulled tight across his massive chest, and a grim expression that carved deep lines into his face. But Lucy didn't flinch. When you have already lost everything you cared about that day, monsters aren't as scary. "Hey," Dutch said. His voice was like a gravel crusher, deep, resonant, rumbling from the bottom of his chest. Lucy wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her cheek. "Hi." Dutch looked at the shattered glass. He looked at the snapped hinge of the table. He looked at the empty, dented cigar box resting in the gutter. He processed the crime scene with the cold, analytical eye of a man who had seen, and inflicted, a great deal of violence. "You cut yourself?" he asked, pointing a thick, scarred finger at the glass. Lucy shook her head. "No, just scraped my elbow." "Who was it?" Dutch didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask why she was crying. He didn't offer empty civilian condolences like, "I'm so sorry," or "Everything will be okay." He spoke to her like an equal, asking for intel. "3 guys?" Lucy sniffled, pointing down the street where the car had vanished. "In a grey car, a loud one. The driver, he had a tattoo of a spiderweb right here." She pointed to her neck. "He pushed me, and he took my money. It was $22. It was for my mum." Dutch's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched under the heavy beard. A guy with a neckweb in a noisy grey Civic. That was Trent. Dutch knew Trent. The kid was a low-level meth runner, a roach who scurried around the edges of the city's criminal underbelly. A nobody. $22. Dutch repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "I was gonna buy her earrings," Lucy whispered, staring at the wet asphalt. The reality of the loss crashed over her again, and she buried her face in her knees, her small shoulders shaking. Dutch stood there for a long moment. To the average person looking out their window, it was a bizarre tableau. A massive, terrifying outlaw biker towering over a weeping 7-year-old in a puddle of lemonade. In the outlaw code, there are lines you cross and lines you don't. You can wage war over territory, you can break a man's jaw over an insult in a bar, but you do not touch children. You do not steal from a working mother. You do not kick over a little girl's lemonade stand. It was a violation of the most fundamental, unspoken law of the streets. It offended Dutch's sensibilities. It disgusted him. Dutch slowly lowered himself into a crouch. His knees popped. He was eye level with the top of Lucy's head. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and gently tapped her on the shoulder. "Hey," he rumbled. Lucy looked up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. "Clean up the glass," Dutch said quietly, his tone flat and serious. "Leave the table. Go inside. Wash your elbow with soap." Lucy blinked, confused. "But my money—" "Don't worry about the money right now," Dutch said. He stood back up, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun, casting a long shadow over the ruined stand. "I'm gonna go make a phone call." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and began the slow walk back to his garage. His hands were no longer hanging loose at his sides. They were curled into tight, heavy fists. When Dutch walked back into his garage, he didn't pick up the wrench. He didn't look at the motorcycle. He walked to the wooden workbench, picked up a battered black smartphone, and hit a speed dial number. He put it to his ear, staring blankly at the pegboard on the wall. The line clicked. "Clubhouse." A gruff voice answered on the other end. "It's Dutch," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the oily confines of the garage. "Hey, brother, what's good?" "I need bodies," Dutch said. The casualness was stripped from his voice entirely. It was cold. It was absolute. "Lot of 'em. Get the president on the line. Tell everyone to gear up and meet at my place. We got a situation in the neighborhood." There was a brief pause on the line. The man on the other end knew Dutch well enough to know he didn't call for backup lightly. "Who are we looking for?" the voice asked. "A punk named Trent in a rusted grey Civic," Dutch said, picking up a heavy steel chain from his bench and tossing it from one hand to the other. "And bring your wallets. We're buying some lemonade." Dutch hung up the phone. Outside, the neighborhood was completely silent, but it was the dead, heavy silence that always precedes a storm. Miles away, across the city, engines were about to fire up. The Hells Angels clubhouse sat on the industrial edge of the city. a cinder-block fortress flanked by razor wire and heavy steel gates. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer, leather, and cigarette smoke. It was a place governed by its own internal gravity, separate from the laws and polite expectations of the civilian world. When the landline on the scarred oak bar rang, Tommy answered it. He listened for 10 seconds, his face hardening, before he hung up and walked over to the pool table. Clay was lining up a shot. He was the charter president, a man with cold, intelligent eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved out of old oak. He didn't raise his voice often because he never had to. That was Dutch, Tommy said, keeping his voice low enough for only the men around the table to hear. He wants bodies, all of them. Someone put hands on a little girl on his street. Robbed her. Clay slowly stood up, placing his cue stick on the green felt. He looked around the room. There were about 40 members present, drinking, talking, existing in the heavy camaraderie of the patch. Who? Clay asked. Local trash. Kid named Trent. Drives a beat-to-hell grey Civic. Clay nodded slowly. The club didn't operate as a charity, and they certainly weren't the police. But the Hells Angels have a rigid, unyielding internal code. You protect your territory, you protect your own, and you obliterate anyone arrogant enough to bring senseless victimization into your backyard. It was a matter of respect. A street-level thug terrorizing a child down the block from a patched member was an insult. It was a contagion that needed to be stamped out before it spread. Make the calls? Clay said. He turned to the room, his voice finally rising, cutting through the background noise of the jukebox. Mount up. We got an errand to run. The mobilization of an outlaw motorcycle club is a terrifyingly efficient process. There is no bureaucracy. There are no forms to fill out in triplicate. The word went out over group texts and encrypted phone calls. Dutch needs bodies. Bring cash. Within 20 minutes, the call had reached neighboring charters in 2 adjacent counties. They didn't just want a show of force. They wanted a biblical plague of chrome and leather. The intelligence gathering was equally swift. Cops rely on warrants and informants. The club relied on the streets. They knew the bartenders at the dive bars, the bouncers at the strip clubs, the mechanics at the chop shops. Tommy made 3 phone calls. On the 4th, a mechanic on the south side confirmed he had just seen Trent's grey Civic pull into the lot behind a dilapidated strip mall off Route 9. The trap was set. Across the city, garage doors rolled up. Kickstands were kicked up. The synchronized firing of heavy V-twin engines began to echo through the concrete canyons of the city. It started as a low, isolated rumble in different neighborhoods, building into a collective, deafening roar as packs of 10, then 20, then 50 riders merged onto the interstate. They rode in a tight, staggered formation. It was a rolling wall of black leather cuts, gleaming chrome, and matte black fairings. The civilian traffic parted for them instinctively. Cars pulled onto the shoulders. Truckers laid on their air horns in a show of respect. The sheer kinetic energy of hundreds of motorcycles moving in perfect, aggressive unison was enough to rattle the fillings in your teeth. At the front of the pack, riding a heavily modified Harley-Davidson Dyna, was Dutch. His face was an emotionless mask behind his dark sunglasses, the wind tearing at his thick grey beard. He wasn't thinking about the law. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He was thinking about a rusted cigar box and a puddle of yellow slush on a cracked sidewalk. Behind the strip mall on Route 9, the afternoon heat was trapped between the brick walls of a discount liquor store and a vacant laundromat. The asphalt was littered with broken glass, crushed tallboy cans, and cigarette butts. Trent's grey Civic was parked diagonally across 2 spaces. All 4 doors were open to let the heat out. The blown-out stereo was still thumping a hollow, distorted bass line. Trent was sitting on the hood of the car, smoking a cheap cigar. Kyle and Bo were leaning against the brick wall, passing around a bottle of warm malt liquor. They were feeling untouchable. In their small, pathetic reality, stealing $22 from a 7-year-old was a victory. It was a story they would embellish and retell to other losers, framing it as a rebellious middle finger to the neighborhood. "You see her face, man?" Trent laughed, blowing a plume of cheap smoke into the stagnant air. Little brat thought she was actually doing something, like, "Welcome to the real world, kid." Kyle took a swig from the bottle. "I don't know, man. We probably shouldn't have smashed the table. Her dad or someone might come looking." "Looking for what?" Trent scoffed, hopping down from the hood. He pulled a fistful of crumpled singles and quarters from his pocket, tossing them onto the roof of the Civic. "Let 'em look. We're gone. And we got gas money." He didn't realize the ground was trembling until the empty malt liquor bottle sitting by the car tire began to vibrate against the asphalt. At first it sounded like thunder, a low, rolling, persistent rumble coming from the west. Trent looked up at the sky, but there wasn't a cloud in sight. The sun was still a blinding, oppressive glare. The rumble grew louder. It didn't sound like weather anymore. It sounded mechanical, heavy, industrial. Bo pushed himself off the brick wall, his eyes narrowing. "The hell is that?" The sound crested. It became a physical pressure in the air, a deafening, chaotic symphony of open exhaust pipes and heavy machinery. Suddenly, the narrow alleyway leading to the back lot was blocked. A wave of black motorcycles poured into the confined space. They didn't come in fast. They came in slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly coordinated. They spread out, fanning across the asphalt, their front tires pointing directly at the grey Civic. Trent's cigar dropped from his lips, bouncing off his shoe. More bikes poured in from the other side of the building, sealing off the opposite exit. They were completely boxed in. The sheer volume of the noise was paralyzing. There were at least 50 bikes in the immediate lot, with more spilling out onto the access road. The men on the bikes were massive, wearing heavy leather vests adorned with the winged death head. The Hells Angels. Trent's stomach turned to ice. The false bravado that had fueled his entire morning evaporated in a split second. He didn't feel like a king anymore. He felt like a mouse trapped in a coffee can. The engines cut off almost simultaneously. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise. The only sound was the ticking of hot engine blocks and the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. Nobody yelled. Nobody rushed them. The psychological terror was in the restraint. The sea of bikers parted down the middle. Dutch walked through the gap. He was flanked by Clay and Tommy, but this was Dutch's operation. He walked slowly, his heavy boots moving with a lethal, relaxed grace. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, a man operating purely on muscle memory and violent intent. Trent took a step backward, his back hitting the hot metal of his car door. Kyle and Bo were frozen against the brick wall, their eyes wide with absolute panic. Dutch stopped 3 feet from Trent. He towered over him. The smell of oil, sweat, and hot leather rolled off the biker in waves. "You Trent." Dutch's voice was barely a rumble, scraping the bottom of his throat. Trent tried to speak, but his throat had seized up. He managed a jerky, terrified nod. Dutch looked at the crumpled bills sitting on the roof of the Civic. He reached out with a massive hand and picked up a single, wrinkled dollar bill. He inspected it, then dropped it back onto the roof. "You like lemonade?" Dutch asked. What?" Trent stammered, his voice cracking. Before Trent could blink, Dutch's hand shot forward. He didn't throw a punch. He simply grabbed Trent by the front of his shirt, twisting the cheap fabric into his massive fist, and slammed him backward against the car. The metal buckled under the impact. Trent gasped for air, his feet momentarily lifting off the ground. "I asked if you like lemonade." Dutch repeated, his face inches from Trent's. The dead, flat look in Dutch's eyes was the scariest thing Trent had ever seen. "Because you owe a little girl down the street $22 and a new pitcher." I got it! I got it!" Trent choked out, his hands scrambling frantically to dig into his own pockets. He was shaking so badly he could barely grasp the fabric. "Take it! Take it all!" Dutch didn't let go. He simply applied more pressure, pulling Trent slightly forward and slamming him back against the door again. A warning, a promise of what would happen if he ever showed his face in that zip code again. "Empty your pockets," Dutch ordered. Trent scrambled, dumping the stolen singles, the quarters, and even his own meager cash onto the hood of the car. Kyle and Bo, eager to survive, practically turned their pockets inside out, throwing their own crumpled bills onto the pile. Dutch finally released his grip. Trent slid down the side of the car, gasping, rubbing his bruised chest. Dutch looked at Tommy. Tommy stepped forward, pulled a heavy leather wallet from his cut, and tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the pile. Clay followed suit. Within 30 seconds, 50 heavily armed, terrifying outlaws were walking past the Civic, silently dropping 20s, 50s, and hundreds onto the hood. The pile of cash grew into a small mountain. Dutch pulled an empty canvas tool bag from his belt and calmly swept the massive pile of cash into it. He zipped it shut. He looked down at Trent one last time. "If I see this grey piece of shit car on my street again," Dutch said softly, "I'm not going to ask for the money back. Understand?" Trent nodded frantically, tears of absolute terror pooling in his eyes. Yes, sir." Dutch turned his back. He didn't look at Kyle or Bo. They didn't exist. He walked back through the parted crowd of his brothers, climbed onto his diner, and kicked the engine over. The deafening roar returned, shaking the brick walls of the strip mall. The trap opened. The column of bikes rolled out, leaving 3 broken, terrified punks standing in a dusty lot, choking on exhaust fumes and the heavy realization of how close they had just come to not walking away. Back on the cracked asphalt of her street, Lucy was still sitting on the front porch. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest. She had washed her scraped elbow in the kitchen sink, just like the big man with the beard had told her to. But the sting on her arm was nothing compared to the heavy, sinking feeling in her chest. The card table was still in the yard, its leg bent at a grotesque angle. The broken glass had been swept into a small pile on the curb, the yellow stain already drying into a sticky, fly-covered patch on the concrete. At 3:30, a faded blue Ford Taurus turned onto the block. Sarah parked in the driveway, turning off the ignition with a weary sigh. She sat in the car for a moment, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. Her feet ached from 8 hours in cheap waitress shoes. Her uniform smelled like stale grease and industrial floor cleaner. She just wanted a shower and a cup of tea. She stepped out of the car, slinging her heavy purse over her shoulder. Then she saw the ruined table. She saw the pile of glass. And she saw her daughter sitting on the porch, her face stained with dirt and dried tears. The exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a fierce maternal panic. "Lucy!" Sarah dropped her purse in the grass and sprinted to the porch. She dropped to her knees, pulling the small girl into her arms, frantically checking her over. "Baby, what happened? Are you hurt? Who did this?" Lucy buried her face in her mother's shoulder. The dam broke again. "I'm sorry, Mum," she sobbed. "I was making a stand, to buy you a present. But some guys came, they broke it, and they took the money." Sarah closed her eyes, pulling Lucy tighter. A hot, angry tear slipped down her own cheek. It was the unfairness of it all that broke her. She worked herself to the bone just to keep the lights on, and the world still found a way to come onto her property and crush her child's spirit. It felt like an impossible, unwinnable fight. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered, rocking her back and forth. "We don't need the money. I just need you. It's just a table. I'm right here." She stood up, holding Lucy's hand, preparing to walk inside and lock the deadbolt against the miserable world outside. Then the ground vibrated. It was subtle at first, a faint, rhythmic thrumming in the soles of Sarah's shoes. She paused, looking toward the end of the street. The sound grew. It wasn't the rattling of a broken muffler or a passing delivery truck. It was a deep, resonant roar, a mechanical thunderstorm rolling steadily closer. Across the street, Mr. Henderson stepped out onto his front porch, shading his eyes with a wrinkled hand. 2 doors down, blinds twitched as neighbors peered out from the safety of their living rooms. The noise became absolute. It drowned out the cicadas. It drowned out the distant hum of the interstate. A single motorcycle turned onto the block. It was massive, black, and gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun. The rider sat tall, his arms spread wide on the ape-hanger handlebars. It was Dutch, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, riding 2 abreast, came another row of bikes, then another, and another. Sarah pulled Lucy behind her leg, her protective instinct flaring. The street, usually quiet and forgotten, was suddenly flooded with leather, chrome, and the deafening roar of heavy engines. They just kept coming. 50, 100, 200. The column stretched around the corner and out of sight, a seemingly endless parade of outlaw power occupying the tiny residential block. They didn't speed. They rolled at a crawling, deliberate pace. Dutch pulled his diner up to the curb, directly in front of Sarah's house. He kicked the stand down and killed the engine. Behind him, like a perfectly orchestrated military maneuver, the massive column of bikers did the same. The sudden cessation of 300 engines was a shock to the ears, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, broken only by the sound of hot metal ticking and the squeak of leather. 300 Hell's Angels had parked on the street. They filled the road from curb to curb. Giant men with scarred arms, heavy boots, and grim faces. Sarah was terrified. She backed up a step, gripping Lucy's hand tighter. She had seen Dutch around, knew he lived down the street, but she had always kept a respectful, fearful distance. Now an entire army was parked on her lawn. Dutch stepped off his bike. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked down at the little girl peeking out from behind her mother's leg. He walked up the short concrete path to the yard. He stopped at the edge of the grass, careful not to step on the ruined card table. He reached into the deep pocket of his leather cut and pulled out a heavy canvas tool bag. He held it out. Lucy let go of her mother's hand. Sarah tried to pull her back. Lucy, no, but the little girl stepped forward. She remembered the man. She remembered he told her to wash her elbow. Dutch dropped to one knee, lowering his massive frame until he was eye level with Lucy once again. He unzipped the canvas bag. Inside were stacks of bills. 20s, 50s, hundreds, crumpled singles, quarters. It was thousands of dollars. "They dropped your change," Dutch said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Lucy stared into the bag, her eyes wide. She looked back up at Dutch, then over his shoulder at the street. 300 hardened bikers were standing silently by their machines. Some were smoking. Some had their arms crossed. All of them were watching the little girl in the front yard. "That's too much," Lucy whispered, pointing at the bag. "I only had $22. The faintest shadow of a smile touched the corner of Dutch's mouth beneath the thick grey beard. "The rest is for the lemonade," Dutch said. "We're very thirsty." He placed the heavy bag gently on the grass at Lucy's feet. Then he reached into his other pocket. He pulled out a small rectangular velvet box. He held it out on his thick, calloused palm. "And I stopped by the pawn shop," Dutch added, his eyes flicking briefly up to Sarah, who was standing paralyzed on the porch, a hand clamped over her mouth in shock. "I think you had an errand to run." Lucy reached out and took the velvet box. She opened it. Inside, resting on white satin, were the silver-plated earrings she had stared at in the window for weeks. She looked at the earrings. She looked at the giant, terrifying man kneeling in her yard. She didn't have the words to articulate the overwhelming shift in her universe. She didn't know about outlaws or street justice or the heavy burden of the patch. She just knew that monsters existed, but so did dragons that protected the castle. Without thinking, Lucy stepped forward and wrapped her small, fragile arms around Dutch's massive, leather-clad neck. The street went dead silent. 300 men, capable of inflicting terrible violence, held their breath. Dutch froze. For a split second, the hardened outlaw didn't know what to do. Then, slowly, carefully, he brought one massive hand up and gently patted the little girl on the back. "Happy birthday, Mom!" Dutch mumbled over Lucy's shoulder, looking at Sarah. He stood up, stepping back from the child. He gave Sarah a single respectful nod. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't want a parade. He turned his back, walked down the concrete path, and swung his leg over his Dina. He kicked the engine over. The deafening roar shattered the silence of the afternoon once again. Down the line, 300 engines fired in unison, a mechanical symphony of raw power. Dutch kicked the bike into gear and rolled slowly down the street. The column followed him, a river of exhaust and chrome, pulling out of the neighborhood as smoothly and purposefully as they had arrived. Sarah sank onto the front steps, her legs finally giving out. She pulled Lucy into her lap, staring at the canvas bag overflowing with cash and the small velvet box clutched in her daughter's hands. The smell of exhaust lingered in the heavy summer air, mixing with the faint scent of spilled artificial lemon. The street was empty again, but it didn't feel tired anymore. It felt safe. The ringing in Sarah's ears took a long time to fade. Long after the last heavy motorcycle had turned onto the interstate, a strange, hollow echo remained in the neighborhood. It was the sound of a disrupted reality. Sarah sat on the front steps, the concrete warm against her thighs. She stared at the heavy canvas bag sitting in the grass. It was stained with dark grease at the bottom, an ugly, utilitarian thing that looked completely out of place next to the overgrown dandelions. She reached out and pulled it toward her. It was heavy. "Mom!" Lucy's voice was small, pulling Sarah back from the edge of shock. The little girl was standing in the doorway, the screen door held open with one foot. She was holding the velvet box tightly against her chest. "Are we in trouble?" Sarah let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the canvas bag. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice rough. "No, we aren't in trouble." She hauled the bag up by its sturdy handles and walked inside, locking the deadbolt behind her. It was a reflex. You don't live in a neighborhood with failing streetlights and broken sidewalks without developing a healthy paranoia. She set the bag on the Formica kitchen table and unzipped it. The smell of old paper, tobacco, and leather wafted up. It wasn't clean money. It was crumpled, folded, worn down by the friction of rough hands and deep pockets. There were wads of $1 bills held together by rubber bands, crisp $100 bills that looked newly minted, and an absurd amount of loose quarters resting at the bottom. Sarah sat down and began to sort it. She didn't want to, but the primal need for survival drove her hands. She smoothed out the wrinkled 20s, stacking them next to the 50s. Her fingers trembled. She had spent her entire adult life calculating the exact to the penny cost of a gallon of milk, a tank of gas, the late fee on a utility bill. Her brain was a permanent ledger of debts. She counted $3,840. Sarah put her hands over her face and wept. She didn't cry beautifully. It was ugly, shoulder-heaving, silent sobbing that tore at her throat. It was the release of a pressure valve that had been whistling in the red for years. This bag of worn paper meant the Ford Taurus could get a new transmission. It meant the eviction notice threatening them for the past 2 months was null and void. It meant she could buy a winter coat for Lucy that actually fit, instead of layering her in 3 thin sweaters. To the men who had dropped it on the hood of a rusted Civic, it was pocket change and a point of pride. To Sarah, it was a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly returning to life, but it felt fundamentally different. Mr. Henderson, the retired mechanic from across the street, walked out of his house carrying a heavy push broom and an aluminum dustpan. He didn't look toward Sarah's house. He didn't knock on the door to gossip. He simply walked over to the curb, methodically swept up the shattered glass of the yellow pitcher, dumped it into his trash bin, and walked back inside. He had lived on the block for 40 years. He knew the unwritten rules of the pavement. A violent, massive force had just exerted its will on their street, and it had done so in the name of justice. You don't question it, you just sweep up the glass and respect the new quiet. That night, for the first time in a very long time, Sarah slept without waking up at 3 a.m. to stare at the ceiling. She slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the canvas bag tucked safely under her bed, right next to a small velvet box containing silver-plated earrings. 2 weeks bled into 3. The suffocating heat wave that had gripped Rockford finally cracked, broken by a violent, rolling thunderstorm that swept in from the plains. The heavy rain washed the baked-in oil stains from the asphalt and cooled the faded aluminum siding of the tightly packed houses. The air tasted different now. It was cleaner, stripped of the oppressive, stagnant humidity. Trent, Kyle, and Beau did not return. Their grey Honda Civic turned up 4 days after the incident, abandoned behind a rotting, bankrupt bowling alley out near the county line. The windshield was shattered into a spiderweb of opaque glass, the tires had been systematically slashed to the rims, and the radio had been ripped out of the dashboard. The local police ran the plates, noted the aggressive vandalism, and had a tow truck haul the useless shell to an impound lot. It sat there, rusting in the tall weeds, entirely forgotten. Rumor on the street was that the 3 punks had scraped together whatever cash they had left and caught a midnight Greyhound to St. Louis. They were terrified. They woke up every morning expecting the distant rumble of a garbage truck to be a reaper coming to collect. Nature usually abhors a vacuum, but the local criminal element was surprisingly reluctant to fill the void left behind on Sarah's block. Word travels fast in the gutters, mutating from fact to myth in a matter of hours. The story of 300 Hells Angels rolling deep into a residential cul-de-sac over a stolen $20 bill became an instant, terrifying urban legend. The corner store, usually a magnet for loitering teenagers breaking bottles and selling cheap weed, sat empty. Packages dropped off on front porches by delivery drivers remained completely untouched until the homeowners retrieved them. The block had become untouchable ground. It belonged to the winged death head. Dutch was back in his natural habitat. His garage was a shadowed, oily sanctuary. He stood over a heavily customized Heritage Softdale, carefully bleeding the hydraulic clutch. The radio on his workbench was tuned to a classic rock station, playing low enough to just be background noise. He was alone. The massive, terrifying army he had summoned with a single phone call was gone, scattered back to the wind, returning to their own lives, jobs, bar stools, and vices. Today, Dutch was just a solitary man with permanent grease packed under his fingernails and a bad left knee that throbbed whenever the barometric pressure dropped. He liked the quiet. He preferred the predictable mechanics of steel and oil to the messy, unpredictable nature of human beings. A stripped gear made sense. People usually didn't. He paused, picking up a red shop rag to wipe a smudge of .4 fluid off his knuckles. That's when he heard the soft, hesitant crunch of footsteps on his gravel driveway. Dutch didn't instinctively reach for the heavy steel wrench on his bench, but his broad shoulders tensed slightly. He turned around slowly. Sarah was standing at the edge of the open garage bay. She was still wearing her diner uniform. The pale blue apron was stained with a splash of dark coffee and something that looked like cherry syrup. She looked bone-tired, carrying the weight of a woman who had spent 8 hours on her feet, carrying heavy ceramic plates. But the permanent, desperate tension that usually pinched the corners of her eyes had softened. She didn't look like a cornered animal anymore. In her hands, she carried a white ceramic plate, tightly covered in aluminum foil, and a large battered green thermos. Dutch looked at her. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a massive, imposing figure blocking out the light from the single overhead bulb. "I get off shift at 2, Sarah said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She wasn't trembling the way she had been on her front steps 2 weeks ago. "The line cook at the diner makes a cherry pie. It's the only thing on the entire laminated menu worth paying money for. He bakes it fresh on Thursdays." She stepped over the threshold, moving into the garage. It was a deeply masculine space, smelling intensely of metal shavings, raw gasoline, and old, sweat-stained leather. She ignored the intimidation factor of the room, walking straight over to his cluttered wooden workbench. She carefully set the foil-covered plate down next to a pile of spark plugs. She placed the green thermos right beside it. "Black coffee," she added, stepping back. "Not the cheap diner stuff. I stopped at the grocery store and bought the good beans." Dutch looked at the foil-covered plate. Then his pale eyes flicked back up to Sarah. He was a man who understood transactions. Blood for blood. Respect for respect. Violence answering violence. But he was deeply, profoundly uncomfortable with civilian gratitude. It blurred the rigid lines he worked very hard to maintain between his world and theirs. "You didn't have to do that," Dutch rumbled, his voice scraping the bottom of his throat. "I know I didn't," Sarah said. She crossed her arms, holding her ground against the giant. "I paid my rent for 6 months, Dutch. I got the Taurus a new transmission. I bought Lucy a heavy winter coat that actually fits her, and a pair of shoes that don't have holes worn through the soles." Dutch picked up his shop rag again, wiping aggressively at a stubborn grease stain on his palm, deliberately avoiding her eyes. "I told you. I just wanted my change back from the kid." "Don't," Sarah said softly. Her voice was firm, carrying a quiet authority. "Don't pretend it was just about the money." Dutch stopped wiping his hands. He tossed the rag onto the seat of the Softail. He looked up, locking his gaze with hers. "I know exactly what you are," Sarah said, refusing to blink. "I know what that patch on your leather jacket means to the state police, and I know what it means to the people in this city. I know you aren't a saint, and I know the things you do." "I never claimed to be a saint," Dutch replied, a low warning vibrating in his chest. "I know," Sarah nodded. "But you saw a little girl broken on the sidewalk, and you brought a literal army to put her back together. You protected us when the rest of the world wouldn't even look our way. So I brought you a pie and some decent coffee." She didn't wait for a tearful admission. She didn't ask for a hug, and she didn't linger to make it awkward. She understood the strict boundaries of the space she was standing in. Sarah gave him a single, respectful nod, turned on her heel, and walked out of the garage, her worn, non-slip shoes crunching softly on the gravel driveway. Dutch stood in the heavy silence of his garage for a very long time. He looked at the disassembled motorcycle parts scattered across his hydraulic lift. He looked at the heavy leather cut hanging on the back of his metal folding chair, the winged death head staring blankly at the wall. Then he reached over to the workbench, peeled back the crinkled aluminum foil, and cut himself a thick slice of cherry pie. It was still warm. Summer burned into late August. The back-to-school sales had started, and the cicadas were growing louder in the evenings, a sure sign that the Midwest was preparing to tilt back toward the cold. On a Saturday morning, Lucy went back into business. The setup was entirely different this time. Mr. Henderson had spent 2 days in his backyard with a circular saw and a pile of treated lumber. He had built a heavy, solid wood stand. It had a wide counter, a reinforced base that couldn't be kicked over by a grown man, and a sturdy roof to provide shade. He had painted it a bright, cheerful yellow. Lucy stood proudly behind the counter. She was wearing a new pair of bright red sneakers. The heavy glass pitcher was gone, replaced by a massive, insulated plastic cooler with a push-button spigot. It was filled with iced tea and lemonade. The sign, painted neatly by Sarah, read, "Lucy's Cold Drinks, 50 cents. She didn't use a rusted cigar box anymore. She had a small, lockable metal cash box secured to the counter with a short bicycle cable. She was learning. The world had shown its teeth, and she had adapted. At 11 a.m., the low rumble of a motorcycle engine drifted down the street. It wasn't an army this time. It was a single bike, a customized black bagger with high handlebars. The rider pulled up to the curb, the heavy engine idling with a rhythmic, powerful thump. He was wearing a black leather cut with the Hells Angels patch on the back. It wasn't Dutch. It was Tommy. Tommy kicked his bike into neutral. He was a massive man with a heavily tattooed scalp and a thick, braided goatee. He looked terrifying enough to clear a dive bar just by walking through the door. He swung his heavy boots off the pegs and walked up to the wooden stand. Lucy looked up at him. She wasn't afraid. She knew the uniform now. "Morning, kid," Tommy said, his voice gravelly. He pulled a crumpled red bandana from his back pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Hot one today?" "Yes, sir," Lucy said politely. "Would you like some lemonade? Or iced tea? Gimme a mix?" Tommy said, "Half and half." Lucy carefully grabbed a plastic cup, held it under the spigot, and poured the perfect Arnold Palmer. She handed it to the giant biker. Tommy took a long drink, draining half the cup in one swallow. He let out a satisfied sigh. "That's the good stuff right there." He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a worn black wallet. He extracted a crisp $5 bill and laid it on the wooden counter. "It's only 50 cents, Lucy said, reaching for the cash box to make change. "Keep it," Tommy said, turning back toward his bike. "Club tax?" He swung his leg over the saddle, kicked the bike into gear, and roared off down the street, leaving a smell of exhaust and warm asphalt in his wake. Over the next few hours, the scene repeated itself. A mailman stopped and bought a cup. A neighbor walking her dog bought 2. And every 45 minutes or so, a lone motorcycle would rumble down the quiet residential street. A biker would pull over, buy a 50-cent cup of lemonade with a $5 or a $10 bill, tell her to keep the change, and ride away. They weren't coordinating it. They weren't holding a meeting. It was just an unspoken rule within the local charter. If you were riding through the west side of the city on a Saturday, you took a slight detour. You paid your respects to the kid. It was a perimeter check, a silent, rolling patrol that communicated a very clear message to anyone watching. This block is ours. This child is ours. Across the street, Mr. Henderson watered his lawn, watching the heavy choppers come and go with a faint smile on his wrinkled face. Inside the house, Sarah was packing a lunch for her afternoon shift, listening to the sporadic, comforting rumble of V-twin engines passing by. And 3 doors down, Dutch sat in a lawn chair in his driveway. He wasn't wrenching on a bike today. He was smoking a cigarette, his dark sunglasses reflecting the bright afternoon sun. He watched a biker with a prospect patch on his vest stop at the yellow wooden stand, hand Lucy a dollar bill, and carefully balance a plastic cup of lemonade on his tank as he rode away. Dutch took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling the smoke into the hot summer air. He watched Lucy carefully place the dollar into her metal cash box. She was smiling. The world is a brutal, cynical place. It is full of petty tyrants, careless cruelty, and a crushing mechanical apathy that can grind the spirit out of anyone who doesn't have the strength to fight back. Monsters roam the streets in rusted cars, looking for easy prey. But sometimes the predators pick the wrong street. Sometimes they fail to realize that the most dangerous things in the dark aren't the monsters at all. Sometimes the most dangerous things are the outlaws who decided long ago that the rules of polite society didn't apply to them, including the rule that says you have to look the other way. Dutch crushed his cigarette out on the concrete, stood up, and stretched his heavy shoulders. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, his heavy boots scuffing the pavement. When he reached the yellow stand, Lucy looked up, her smile widening. "Hey, Dutch," she said. "Hey, kid," Dutch rumbled. He looked at the plastic cooler. "You got any plain lemonade left?" Lucy nodded, quickly filling a cup to the brim. She handed it to him. Dutch reached into his jeans, pulled out a single silver quarter, and placed it on the wooden counter. Then he pulled out another. 50 cents. Exact change. He didn't need to leave a massive tip today. He didn't need to make a grand gesture. He took a sip of the cold, sugary drink, looking down the quiet, secure street. "Good lemonade," Dutch said quietly. "Thanks." Lucy beamed. Dutch gave her a single nod, turned around, and walked back to his garage. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The street was quiet, the glass was swept away, and the little girl had her stand. The world was, for a fleeting, beautiful moment, exactly as it should be. The world doesn't always play fair. Most days, the bad guys walk away laughing. But every once in a while, karma shows up wearing heavy leather and riding a chopped Harley. Dutch and his brothers didn't just fix a broken table. They reminded a forgotten neighborhood that nobody is invisible, and that real protectors don't always wear badges. If this story of outlaw justice hit you right in the chest, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that loyalty still exists, and subscribe for more raw, grounded stories. Leave a comment below. What's the best act of street justice you've ever witnessed?